Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are stepping into a profoundly important conversation, one that sits right at the intersection of cutting-edge technology and ancient, unchanging truths. For the scholars, pastors, and biblical researchers joining us, we're going to take a rigorous, deeply analytical look at the theological and practical implications of using artificial intelligence in ministry. Let me be clear right up front. We are not here for tech industry hype, and we aren't going to frame pastoral ministry as a mere productivity problem. We are here for a sober, serious examination of how to interact with these tools faithfully. Let's dive in.
Here's the roadmap for our time together. We're going to cover the ontological divide, mapping the secular shift, the myth of AI neutrality, the digital scriptorium, the prompt verify apply cycle, and we will close out with the slow work of formation.
Starting with Section 1, the ontological divide. If we're going to navigate this landscape safely, we have to start with our foundational methodology. We must establish an absolute, uncrossable boundary between the human scholar and the digital machine.
Notice just how starkly this line needs to be drawn. On the left, you have the statistical language model. At its absolute core, it is nothing more than a text pattern matchmaker. It's probabilistic, and it is entirely unregenerate. Now look at the right. That's the human scholar. You are a bearer of the Tselem Elohim. Your work is teleological, meaning it is directed toward a divine purpose, and you are uniquely illuminated by the Ruach. We can never, ever blur this line. The tool calculates, the human communes.
Because of this divide, it is absolutely crucial that we completely de-anthropomorphize this technology. Large language models do not possess religious faith, they have no conscience, no internal values, and no lived commitments. So when an AI generates a response that sounds remarkably warm or pastoral, it isn't feeling empathetic. It's simply generating contextually dependent language based on the statistical constraints of its training data. Keeping this front of mind protects us from treating a chatbot like an oracle.
Section 2. Mapping the secular shift. With our ontological boundary firmly in place, let's look at some empirical data to expose the actual cultural assumptions woven into these models.
The source material for our analysis leverages the World Values Survey to map out these AI systems. This survey uses two main axes. The vertical axis runs from traditional, which values religious importance and inherited authority, up to secular, which is far less tradition-bound. The horizontal axis runs from survival, focusing on security and social order, all the way over to self-expression, which highly values autonomy, individual choice, and expressive freedom. The key takeaway here is that these are sociological dimensions mapping broad cultural dispositions. They are not scales measuring intelligence or objective moral worth.
So, what happens when frontier AI models take this survey? Well, the results are pretty striking. Almost all of them cluster heavily in the secular and self-expression quadrant. They plot incredibly far away from the traditional and survival regions, which, by the way, is where much of the global human population actually lives. Models like GPT-4o and DeepSeek R1 show highly secular scores, while others like Gemini show extreme self-expression scores. The data proves conclusively that these systems are not globally representative. This quote really highlights the severity of this shift. Think about this. The default framing of these models often privileges autonomy and therapeutic language over inherited moral norms to a degree that outpaces some of the most secular nations on Earth. If you're a pastor or biblical researcher, you need to understand this. The default voice you are interacting with leans heavily and systematically toward late modern individualism.
That brings us to Section 3, the myth of AI neutrality. The data we just looked at forces a critical realization. We have to challenge the widespread assumption that AI systems are culturally or ethically neutral tools for academic work. They absolutely are not.
So we have to ask the obvious question, why does this happen? Why do frontier models built by competing tech companies across the globe all seem to converge on this secular self-expression tilt? The answer actually lies in how these models are trained to be quote-unquote safe.
Let's walk through why this happens. It's driven by a process called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF. First, a base model learns diverse text patterns from all over the internet. Then, human evaluators step in. They compare the AI's replies, rewarding what they deem helpful and safe. But what does safe mean to a secular tech company? It usually means avoiding categorical moral judgments, affirming individual choice, and presenting contested moral claims as purely pluralistic. By rewarding this late modern liberal moral grammar, the system is inherently trained to penalize traditional authoritative responses.
Now, some developers try to fix this using constitutional AI, where the model is governed by explicit written principles instead of just human feedback. But while this is configurable, building a non-secular constitution is incredibly complex. It forces developers to make explicit, difficult choices. Think about it. Which authority governs? Whose interpretation of that authority is prioritized? When individual autonomy conflicts with traditional norms, how does the model adjudicate that conflict? Because these choices are so fraught and commercially risky, public models just default to secular pluralism.
Moving to Section 4, the digital scriptorium. Knowing all of this inherent bias, how on earth do we use these tools faithfully? Well, we have to establish strict, unyielding boundaries for our pastoral and academic workflows.
The entire foundation of the digital scriptorium concept rests on understanding the absolute difference between mapping and adjudicating. I want you to think of AI as an advanced library assistant. It is incredibly fast at mapping, gathering data, retrieving sources, and outlining historical arguments. But it must never, ever be permitted to adjudicate. It cannot render final theological, pastoral, or exegetical judgments. That is the exclusive, non-delegable domain of the human scholar.
Let's look at a practical example from biblical studies to make this concrete. AI is highly technically competent. It can instantly gather morphological data for Greek words like ekklesia. It can rapidly chart the semantic range of complex terms like theopneustos across centuries of literature. It can even map out intricate discourse relations. But, and this is a massive but, it cannot evaluate the spiritual weight, the divine intent, or the normative theological counsel of those findings. Never confuse technical competence with normative counsel.
Notice exactly who holds the power in this human agent workflow. When parsing Greek, the AI offers provisional morphology, but the human retains absolute control by checking the standard lexica. For discourse analysis, the AI might propose structural patterns, but the human tests them against textual signals. And for theology, the AI simply maps the historical arguments. It's the human who determines the exegetical warrants and doctrinal coherence. You curate the shelves. You verify the sources.
Section 5, the prompt, verify, apply cycle. To actually enforce this boundary in your daily work, you need a disciplined methodology. You need a way to safely extract value from the AI without passively adopting its biases. We call this the prompt, verify, apply cycle. Step 1 is worldview-aware prompting. You must demand that the AI explicitly state rival frameworks, rather than letting it quietly default to its secular baseline. Step 2 is disciplined verification. You have to check all claims against primary sources. Never trust an unverified citation from a language model. Step 3 is pastoral application. You take the mapped data and you exercise your independent ecclesial and spiritual judgment. Frankly, accepting an unprompted assistant voice as an objective neutral party is simply a theological failure.
Practically speaking, you should be using a standing research charter in your prompts. Tell the model exactly how to behave up front. State your method clearly. Demand fairness so it doesn't caricature conservative or orthodox views. Enforce epistemic discipline by requiring the AI to flag when texts or scholarly consensus are genuinely uncertain, and maintain strict pastoral limits. Explicitly command the model never to impersonate divine authority or offer direct pastoral counsel. You have to force it to expose its reasoning layers.
Here is a remarkably powerful tool for your scriptorium, the counter-bias audit. After the AI gives you an answer, command it to review its own output for hidden therapeutic, consumerist, or secular liberal assumptions. Ask it to quote exactly where those biases appear in its response, and then have it rewrite the text neutrally. This reverse audit forces those hidden premises into the light and drastically improves the intellectual honesty of your research process.
Finally, Section 6, the slow work of formation. As we wrap up, we must conclude with a stark pastoral warning regarding the true, hidden cost of outsourcing the intellectual and spiritual labor of ministry.
There is a massive temptation today to use AI as a shortcut. It's incredibly tempting to use it for rushed sermon prep or hasty academic writing. But please hear this clearly. In pastoral ministry, efficiency is not a fruit of the Spirit. Spiritual formation does not happen instantly. It occurs in the slow, agonizing work of praying, staring at the text, wrestling with original languages, and seeking God's face. If we use AI to bypass that sacred struggle, we are risking severe cognitive and spiritual atrophy.
To summarize our entire approach today, let the digital scriptorium widen your search. Let it sharpen your questions. Let it expose alternatives you hadn't considered. But never, ever let a text pattern matchmaker determine your doctrinal authority, your moral telos, or your final exegetical judgment. That heavy, glorious responsibility belongs strictly to you.
I want to leave you with this provocative reflection as you return to your studies and your congregations. When you sit down in your study to prepare to preach, teach, and feed the flock, whose voice are you ultimately relying on? Are you resting on the algorithmic, patterned probabilities of a machine? Or are you diligently, desperately seeking the illuminating presence of the Ruach? Use the tools, map the data, but fiercely safeguard your reliance on divine illumination. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep wrestling with the text.